Hi folks, welcome. Thanks for coming today. I'm John Crippen, Director of Hennepin History Museum. We are really thrilled to have Dr. Kasey Keeler here. She's a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think she can talk about her background in a little bit more detail. But Dr. Keeler was raised in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, still has family here in the metro area. She co-led the Wakpadon Bassett Creek Oral History Project that we worked with local church in Golden Valley on in 2021 already. That was a while ago. This was a wonderful project of collecting oral histories of Indigenous folks in the suburbs, which is part of her scholarship and research, which you'll hear about today. Those 14 interviews we were honored to bring into our collection. But one of the things I like to annoy our archivist, Michelle, about is saying, yes, we would happily take this into the collection, but what else? Like, let's not just passively wait for researchers to find these resources. How can we do programming to activate new collections? And so that oral history project resulted in several years now of programming to center and highlight Indigenous voices and tell histories that people haven't heard enough about. So we've just loved that partnership, loved the opportunity that it brought about. So Kasey's going to talk about American Indians and the American Dream, and we're just really excited to hear your insights on this topic. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here this weekend. I feel like it's a toss-up. The weather's beautiful, so people aren't scared to leave their houses, but then it's like everybody wants to get outside this afternoon, I'm sure. So this is perfect timing. So good morning. To begin, I would like to thank the Hennepin History Museum for inviting me to speak today. I'm happy to contribute to this rich programming and share my research with all of you, including the work of my first book, American Indians and the American Dream, and the ways that this past research is now pivoting into my new line of research for my next book project. I also want to acknowledge the Dakota peoples and homelands that we gather on today, and to offer my thanks and appreciation to the Dakota people, past, present, and future, as they continue to steward this land with care and love. So today I'm going to share a little bit about my background, how I came to this first book project, provide an overview of the book, some of the arguments that are framed in the book, and then I'll pivot into where my new line of research is going, building off this first book. And I also welcome any questions at the end during a Q&A session. American Indians and the American Dream is a historical monograph about American Indian peoples and places, specifically looking at the suburban Twin Cities, thinking about access to suburbs, particularly housing, and the ways that American Indian people came to access home ownership. While the entirety of the book spans the mid-19th century to the early 2000s, I use my own family as a way to narrate the book, most obviously through the introduction. In examining my own family's history and trajectory of suburban home ownership, and then my role as a young adult working with Native youth and families in suburban Twin Cities, I kept coming back to this question of why it felt like American Indian people did not belong, or perhaps were not necessarily welcomed in the suburbs, in the way that their identity as American Indian people was made invisible in the suburbs, and particularly through home ownership. So for me, I am now a homeowner in Madison, Wisconsin. This is a story that is continuing to unfold, and this is a story that begins in Oklahoma, where I was born. So my family came to Madison, Wisconsin in the late 1980s. Wait, my family came to Minnesota in the late 1980s, where we were renters before my parents were able to purchase a home in suburban Coon Rapids, which was still then a very much growing and developing suburbs, as many of you know, just about 20 miles north of here along the Mississippi River. So as a youth, I participated in the school's Indian education programming through District 11, the largest school district in the state, but never seriously reflected on my own identity. So I always knew I was a Native person. My mom is American Indian, my dad's not Native, but I never really thought very much about why my family lived here in Minnesota, but most of my family was in Oklahoma and California. So my mom, who is an enrolled tribal citizen of the Tuolumne Band of Miwok, was born and raised in California, and she lives there now. My parents divorced and when I was in high school, and after that, my mom moved back to California. So we are the first generation to not live on our reservation in California. So I grew up in Coon Rapids. I went to college at the University of Wisconsin, and then I came back to Coon Rapids after graduating. And my first job was working for the District 11 School District's Indian Education Program. So the same program that I went through as a K through 12 student. And I was a liaison and with working with the American Indian students and their families kind of as a go-between between the schools and school district. So in that role and really reflecting on my own identity now as like a young 20-year-old, right, through a much more critical lens, thinking about what does it mean to be a Native person in the suburbs. Working with these young Native American youths, I often had conversations with them about their regular family trips, often to reservations in northern Minnesota on the weekends or spending quite a bit of time up north. But I also experienced a lot of what we would call racism, microaggression by school district staff. You know, things like, well, why are these students being taken out of my class? Why do they need to do this Indian education program? My class is so much more important. They're missing 20 minutes. Or these kids have blonde hair. They don't look Native. So a lot of, again, microaggressions that we know are racism, and really thinking about the complexity of identity and how American identity gets collapsed in the suburbs when you look a particular way, when you have a particular socioeconomic status that doesn't necessarily align with stereotypes of American Indians. So during that time, I began to, again, think more critically about these questions. And at that point, I also began pursuing graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and I entered a PhD program here at the University of Minnesota in American Studies. So these questions really kind of framed a lot of my dissertation research that morphed into the first book project. So in the book, I have a series of guiding questions, and these include, why does there seem to be such a disconnect between American Indian people and the suburbs and suburbia? How have American Indians experienced suburbanization and home ownership, particularly across the second half of the 20th century and now in the 21st century? How has federal policy, both housing policy and federal Indian policy, shaped how American Indian people access suburbs and suburbanization? And then why is there such a failure today and in the past to think about suburbs as historically Indian places, right? Suburbs aren't places that just appeared out of nothing post-World War II through the GI Bill and mass home construction. These have always been Indigenous places, and across places like Minnesota, all we have to do is look at place names to be immediately reminded of that. So the book has an introduction and a conclusion, of course, but it also has 5 chapters. And the chapters are framed in chronological order, beginning with the mid-19th century. So to answer the questions that guide the book, I look back in time. So though these are contemporary questions, their origins are centuries older and largely lay in histories of Indigenous dispossession and federal policy. To think through American Indians and suburbs, I look at what I see as 5 key temporal moments of intersection between federal housing policy and federal Indian policy, with a focus on Minnesota. So these temporal moments include Chapter 1, which looks at the ways the Homestead Act, which was signed into law on May 20th, 1862, opened up millions of acres of land just weeks prior to the unfolding of the U.S. Dakota War that unraveled in late August and September. So this chapter really digs into Indigenous dispossession and the rapid exponential growth of non-Native settlers to this landscape, highlighting the ways Native people, Dakota in particular, were forced out of their homelands to make way for settlers, a process that is inherently violent. So Chapter 2 moves on to look at 1934 and the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, which was created by the National Housing Act on June 27th, and the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act on June 18th. So literally a matter of days apart from one another. In this chapter, I call attention to the ways American Indians saw the return of tribal autonomy following the disastrous allotment policy, but how, despite achieving citizenship in 1924, many American Indian people were still excluded from housing policy and programs that were intended to make home ownership a reality for most Americans. In Chapter 3, I look at the intersection of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs American Indian Relocation Program that rapidly unfolded following World War II. So these two programs, the GI Bill and relocation, really reveal the ways housing and home ownership was always envisioned as separate and distinct for American Indian people and for other, particularly white Americans. The GI Bill is well recognized for its home loan benefit, allowing World War II veterans to access housing in these newly developing suburbs. But for American Indian veterans, this opportunity was largely foreclosed, as many were instead directed to pursue relocation, a program that provided temporary federal assistance to move American Indian people off of their reservations to designated urban areas, including places like Minneapolis. And these opportunities included short-term housing, oftentimes for a matter of just weeks, at like the local YMCA, or rental housing that was often in overcrowded, sometimes condemned apartments. The focus of Chapter 4 is the creation of HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Program, as a cabinet-level agency in 1965, as a component of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, and then the development and creation of the Little Earth housing complex just blocks away from here in Minneapolis in 1973. So in this chapter, I really work to highlight the tension that exists around federal funding for housing programs broadly, and then American Indian housing programs more specifically. I work to draw attention to the limits of federal funding for American Indian housing, and thinking about the way federal housing for American Indians is overwhelmingly directed to on-reservation communities, and what does that mean today when so many American Indian people live off reservations, and the way tribal communities are meant to kind of navigate that. So I look at the failure of HUD through levels of bureaucracy and the ways that American Indian housing is, particularly off-reservation housing, is funded despite the promise of housing for American Indian people that we can trace back to treaties. Finally, in Chapter 5, I move to the early 2000s to think about more contemporary American Indian suburbanization and housing and home ownership, and the early 2000s kind of housing boom that came out of the Bush and Clinton era policies. So today I'm going to focus on just 3 of these chapters so I can talk a little bit about some of the newer research as well. So shifting gears a bit and going back in time to the mid-19th century, this slide in particular provides a bit of historical context to think through the book Interventions and Arguments. So here we have 2 images. The one on the left is a map created by Alan Ominsky in 1999 and reproduced in the book Making Minnesota Territory. This image shows the different treaties that occurred across present-day Minnesota to break up tribal lands holdings and to force Ojibwe, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk people onto reservations across the state. So when you look at the map, you can see the green shaded areas, and those are the Ojibwe reservations. And then in the second half, or southern half of the state, there's the red dots, which represent the Dakota communities here. So the Ho-Chunk also spent a brief period of time in present-day Minnesota when they were forcibly exiled from Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunk moved across areas of central and southern Minnesota, and then were also forcibly removed from the state following the US-Dakota War as well. So then the image on the right, Dakota Diaspora, was created by Bob Warner, and this image shows the extent of Dakota movement out of the state of Minnesota in the violent aftermath of the US-Dakota War. So there's lots of movement happening in the years that followed the US-Dakota War. Families were torn apart and separated, communities were torn apart and separated, and this was a years-long process with Dakota people moving south, west, and north up into Canada as well. So the book opens looking at this time frame, the mid-20th century, when the federal government was actively working to acquire Indian land through the treaty-making process in order to open that land to non-native settlers. Between 1850 and 1910, there was exponential growth in the non-native population in the state of Minnesota. In 1850, the non-native population of the territory was just over 6,000, and by 1910, the non-native population had exploded to over 2 million individuals. This rapid influx of non-native settlers absolutely contributed to the US-Dakota War and exile that continues to contribute to the lack of access to Dakota homelands today for Dakota people. Mid-19th century Minnesota was a time of dramatic change, and it really shaped the coming decades and centuries. So jumping forward, the next major time period that I examine in the book is the mid-1930s. So within weeks of one another in 1934, the federal government passed legislation creating the Federal Housing Administration, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs put a halt to the allotment process through the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA for short. One of the legacies of the Federal Housing Administration, which is regularly reflected on today, is the history of discriminatory lending policies, namely the practice of redlining that worked in tandem with race-based covenants to exclude persons other than those belonging to the Caucasian race from owning property. So on this slide, on the right-hand side is one of the most circulated images of a redlining map of Minneapolis from the 1930s. So we can see small pockets of green down by Lake Calhoun, and these can be considered the best neighborhoods. Larger areas of deep blue would be considered neighborhoods that are still desirable. Neighborhoods that were shaded in yellow are described as definitely declining. And finally, neighborhoods in red were labeled as hazardous. So this is how redlining worked. The term comes from these color-coded maps. So by assigning grades and colors to neighborhoods that corresponded to perceived investment risk for mortgages. So here, neighborhoods in red, the term redlining, received the letter grade of D, and investors and banks were strongly discouraged from lending to persons seeking to buy a home in those areas. So the image on the left is a contemporary map from Just Deeds that highlights properties across the city of Edina whose deeds included race-based covenants. And Edina is one of these well-documented locations of race-based covenants that has been, and it's a place that's been written about quite extensively because of their race-based covenants. So Edina is a well-cited example of how the race-based covenants worked and were used. So when we look at this, again, contemporary map, we can see the properties that are shaded in red, and those properties had deeds that includes race-based covenants intended to keep people from non-white races from living there. So in looking at some of these covenants, there's exclusions where non-white people can live in an outbuilding. If you look at the census data then that corresponds to these properties, often the people that were non-white living in these properties were the hired help, right? Often maids, domestic servants, etc. So in the upper right-hand corner of the map on the left, you can kind of see this high concentration of homes, properties with race-based covenants, and that is the Country Club district of Edina. So these race-based covenants were commonplace during the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. In 1948, the court case Shelley v. Kramer struck down race-based covenants as unenforceable. However, in many cases, they went unchallenged and remained. So the purpose of this Just Deeds initiative is for individual homeowners today to track down their property deed and do the legwork of removing that race-based covenants. Yes, discharge it. So jumping forward to more contemporary times, in the 21st century, the chapter, the last chapter of the book looks at the Section 184 Home Loan Program, which is the first and only off-reservation home ownership program for American Indian people. So this program first began in 1992, and it was limited to on-reservation use. Then in 2004, the program was expanded to off-reservation areas as well. So the Section 184 Home Loan Program allows individuals who are enrolled tribal citizens of federally recognized tribes the ability to access a suite of programs offered by HUD. So this program is administered by HUD. So the Section 184 Home Loan Program offers those who are eligible for it, again, enrolled tribal citizens of federally recognized tribes, low down payments, low interest rates, no monthly private mortgage insurance, and access to support from HUD in Washington, D.C. So this sounds great on the surface, and I think it is a great program, but when we look at this map, we have to recognize that there's limits to this program. So this map is dated from 2019, so obviously now it's 7 years old, but I like this map because it has these numbers on the state that I'll get to, but that's why the map is so old, is I don't think they're publishing ones that have this amount of data on them anymore. So we see the United States and we see states shaded in yellow. So for the states that are shaded in yellow, The Section 184 home loan program can be used across the entirety of the state, any county within that state. Federally, individuals who are enrolled tribal citizens of federally recognized tribes can use the benefits of the Section 184 home loan program across that whole entire state. So, for example, my sister bought a home in Elk River, and we are enrolled tribal citizens of the Tuolumne Band of Miwok. So where you live doesn't have to match up with like your tribal homeland, so to speak. For states that are shaded in red, only certain counties are places that people can use the Section 184 home loan program. And of course, there's a corresponding website, and you go to the website and it tells you the counties that you can use the home loan program in. And then there are states that are white, and these states are considered ineligible. So even if an individual is an enrolled tribal citizen of a federally recognized tribe, say they live in Georgia, they are not able to access the Section 184 home loan program.
Is that determined by state legislature?
This is very murky, and who gets to decide this at the federal level. And it's something that I kind of look at in the book. So these decisions are made at the federal level in what areas are deemed service areas. But in looking at this map, and as a scholar of American Indian studies, we know that there are fewer states on the eastern kind of seaboard that that today have federally recognized tribes in them, right? Because colonization occurred there earlier and it looked a lot different, and tribal communities were forced out of these areas earlier, and they were often forced further west, right? So it's really murky, and even though we know that these states in white are tribal homelands to tribal nations, if there isn't a tribal nation located there today. So that's kind of the murkiness of this. So again, this is from 2019, but you see these numbers on the state. So this represents the Section 184 home loans within that state to date. So again, 2019 is the last year that I have been able to find, the most recent year that I have been able to find this information like publicized in a nice visual like this. So I think of Minnesota and Wisconsin as very similar, but you can see that as of August 2019, there had only been 558 individuals who had used the Section 184 home loan program, but 3 times that number in Wisconsin. Nearly 1,700 people had used it. So it's really interesting to look at. Also, New York, I want to point out, is a really interesting example. So it's a state that's shaded in red, so only certain counties. But if you go on the website, the Section 184 website, you can look to see where you can't use it. The only place you can't use it in the entire state of New York are the counties immediately surrounding New York City. So those places I haven't lived in New York. I've actually never even been there, but obviously places that we assume have extremely, extremely high property values, right? So another thing about this home loan program is that the home loans that can be guaranteed through it has to be like reasonable for that county, right? So again, just like making numbers up, you probably couldn't buy a home in Anoka County for like $15 million, right? Because that far exceeds the average home price there. So question.
So how do you explain the fact that Oklahoma, everybody knows about it? That's what I'm guessing. It's sort of knowledge about the program. Everybody in Oklahoma knows about it, and so they take advantage of it.
Yeah.
It hasn't gotten out as much of it. So.
Yeah. Another thing about this home loan is that only certain banks are able to administer it, and they have to go through this particular HUD training for the Section 184 home loan program. So again, you can go to the website and you can see the authorized lenders. So I would say that Oklahoma has significantly more lenders than other places. So, for those of you who have purchased a home, it's hard to work with a bank that is far away, right? And of course, then only certain banks can lend in certain places.
So is Wells Fargo and US Bank our big ones? Are they part of it?
The last time I checked, no. A lot of these banks are banks that are connected to tribal nations, like smaller lenders. Yeah. Yes.
That's a federal program. Why doesn't it apply to all states?
So it goes back to this murkiness and the way that the federal government, for the purposes of this home loan, has defined Indian service area. So my argument would be it should just be able to be used everywhere, right? But I don't get to make the decisions, unfortunately. So just thinking about those 3 chapters in particular, but the book as a whole, some of the major interventions of the book, if you have no interest in reading it, I will just tell you what the takeaway is today. So the primary interventions that I see for American Indians in the American Dream is contributing to creating a space for suburban Indians. So this research firmly situates suburban Indians as a distinct category of American Indian people who are separate from reservation-based American Indian people, but also then distinct from urban Indians. Suburban Indians as a subcategory provides a more accurate lens from which to think about American Indian people, especially contemporarily, as we know more and more American Indian people are moving to metropolitan areas, and especially today to suburban areas. And not just today, but over the last 50 plus years. So throughout the book, not only do I work to situate American Indian people in suburbs, but also to think about the ways that American Indian people were active participants in processes of suburbanization. So American Indian people weren't just kind of like hanging out and standing by, and this is something that happened around them. They participated, they advocated for themselves, they sought out home loans and home ownership. So especially from the 1930s on, American Indian people sought out ways to access suburban living and increasingly home ownership when they often had the doors shut in their faces, right? Because of things like racism. So this remains true today as an increasingly sizable and visible American Indian middle class has taken shape, and much of this is due to access to housing through the form of home ownership. A sub-theme throughout the book calls attention to the ways we think about suburbs today and challenges the widely held assumption that suburbs are white places. Instead, I argue that suburbs are historically indigenous places to not only highlight the ways indigenous dispossession was and continues to operate, but to remind readers that American Indian people have always lived in these places. Part of this is also reminding readers of the importance of learning the histories of the places everybody calls home. American Indians and the American Dream also does the important work of peeling back historical layers to reveal the ways American Indian people were specifically impacted and excluded by federal housing programs. So this adds to the body of literature that looks at African Americans, for example, in exclusion in housing programs. There's also been some more literature in the last decade that looks at Latino folks in housing, and a little bit of literature as well that looks at Asian Americans in housing. So the longer body of scholarship has focused on African Americans and the way they've experienced exclusionary housing policies. And this is all extremely important, and we need more of all of it. But this is one of the first books that looks at American Indians' experiences with housing and exclusion. Finally, American Indians and the American Dream is important because of the stories and the reality that it shares. So as I've already mentioned, increasing numbers of American Indian people are moving to suburban areas and accessing home ownership. So this isn't just a story about my family, but it rings true for thousands of American Indian people from coast to coast. So drawing on this literature, in academia, it's always like, what are you going to publish next? Your first book is out. You get tenure. What's next? When's that next book coming, Kasey? So my dissertation really thought about suburbs as historically Indian places. And as I moved into the book, I kept coming back to this federal policy, right? The housing policy and Indian policy. And now moving to the second book, I'm getting super into the Homestead Act. So kind of coming back to that first chapter, but really digging deeper. So when I look towards this next book project, tentatively titled Homesteading Indian Country, Legacies of Land and Law, I want to expand on and deepen my interrogation of the Homestead Act of 1862, which briefly made an appearance in the first chapter of my book. So in this new line of research, I dive into the Homestead Act as a critical policy that cemented what property accumulation and land tenure would look like in the United States, including thinking through how the Homestead Act has become so synonymous with land ownership in the United States. So as such, I explore what the Homestead Act represents for whom, and why. To answer these questions, I center Indigenous histories and experiences with land ownership, and I look to the ways Native people, tribal communities, and Indigenous-led organizations have accessed land as capital to resist and challenge settler colonialism. So the Homestead Act, passed by a majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate on May 20th, 1862, was arguably the most significant land policy in the United States. It was a policy of land redistribution. As land was acquired by the federal government through treaties, land cession, war, and purchase, it was placed into the public land coffers. From there, the land was surveyed and opened for settlement through sale or through the Homestead Act. However, this was not always a linear process. In total, nearly 4 million homesteaders accessed land under the Homestead Act, claiming 270 million acres of land across 30 states. To qualify for land under the Homestead Act, you had to be age 21 or over and head of a family. The Homestead Act was open to women, including single women. You were to be a U.S. citizen or to have filed paperwork to become a U.S. citizen. The process was relatively simple. Homesteaders were to select an unoccupied parcel of land up to 160 acres that had been surveyed by the federal government. Once the land was identified, you were to file a land claim with the local land office and pay a small processing fee. The individual and/or family then had 5 years to improve upon the land, which could be building a house, raising crops, bringing livestock there, building a fence around your property, and they were to remain in residence for that 5-year period. After 5 years, the individual could then file a deed of title after demonstrating, generally through a witness, like a neighbor, that they had made improvements, built a home, and remained in residence. When the Homestead Act was passed, it was in the midst of the U.S. Civil War, and again, just months before the U.S. Dakota War. It also coincided with other major federal land redistribution programs, including the Pacific Railway Act and the Morrill Act. At the same time, American Indians were not yet considered citizens of the United States, though of course there were some exceptions to this, largely based on perceived assimilation. As such, American Indians were in theory not eligible for land under the Homestead Act. Then, in 1875, the Homestead Act was amended and expanded to allow American Indians to to claim and settle land via agriculture. In order to claim the title for deed after the 5-year period, American Indians were, perhaps to no surprise, required to abandon their tribal relations and tribal identity. What we would recognize today is their tribal citizenship. So the first homestead was located in Beatrice, Nebraska, and it was a land claim filed by a man named Daniel Freeman on January 1st, 1863 at 12:01 a.m. So literally a minute after the act took effect. The next photo that you see on this slide, and this doesn't have to do with anything with American Indians other than I think it's really interesting. So the next photo is the last homestead in the United States claimed by Kenneth W. Deerdorf, who filed for deed of title on May 5th, 1988 for a 50-acre homestead in Stony River, Alaska. So a pretty wide swath, right? In looking at the Homestead Act, I am thinking about the ways whiteness has been constructed, particularly during the 19th century, and the ways that whiteness, and thus Americanness, at least for some people, hinges on private property ownership. When the Homestead Act was passed in 1862, while race was not a question that was asked on the Homestead Act application, the paperwork, citizenship was. And citizenship, as you all likely know, was foreclosed for those who were not white, including American Indians, Black people, and Asian Americans. So building on the arguments that I make in American Indians and the American Dream, the Homestead Act was about private property accumulation for white Americans and would-be American Indians, but it also served as an early housing policy, giving settlers free land with the expectation that they build a house. So I'm going to try to go really fast through these last few slides so that we have time for some Q&A. So this slide is a little bit hard to show or see, but I'm happy to leave this up here if people want to come up later or even take a peek at my computer. In Minnesota, there were over 85,000 total homestead land patents that were issued across this state by the time the Homestead Act came to a close here in 1976. So this image highlights my ongoing research that aims to map the Homestead Act across the United States. So I've been working with a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and he's a trained cartographer. And he's really immersed himself into learning this history alongside me. And together we have been reviewing land records from the Bureau of Land Management, which includes spatial data, which is why we can make the maps. So here we have been mapping the Homestead Act across specific geographies, including Minnesota. And up here you see 8 images. So the first image is Minnesota in 1850 before the Homestead Act, 1860 before the Homestead Act, so 1870 after the Homestead Act, 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, and 1920. And what you can probably make out, I'm hoping, again, you're welcome to come out, is that there's some like pink showing up. And the pink are the homesteaded parcels. So we don't see them in 1850 or 1860 because the Homestead Act hadn't passed, but you can see the land cessions and then the reservation boundaries as well, which you can still see on the later decades as well. So in the middle row, years 1870, 1880, and 1890, we can see how settlement via the Homestead Act really took hold in the southern portion of the state on the heels of Dakota exile. At the same time, you can see the elimination of Dakota reservations from the state, and that as settlement via the Homestead Act spread north toward Ojibwe communities, those reservations also were reduced in size. Finally, the bottom row shows years 1900, 1910, and 1920. Here we see that settlement, again, via the Homestead Act, is essentially widespread across the state of Minnesota. And we also begin to see homestead parcels popping up on reservations at places like Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, White Earth, Fond du Lac, Bois Fort, and Grand Portage. In fact, in Minnesota, there were over 1,270 homestead parcels on tribal lands. So homesteading on tribal reservations became increasingly common, particularly after allotment, when homesteading advocates actively agitated for the further division of reservation land and the opening of surplus land. Homesteading on tribal lands that became public through land cessions and/or allotment became a legal mechanism endorsed by the federal government to prevent the return of land to tribes through legal challenges, particularly after treaty making ended and land was dubiously acquired. Homesteading then solidified the transfer of lands away from tribes, whereas Indian ownership of land was reduced to right to occupancy via Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823. Settler occupancy of land over time has continuously led to outright ownership. As the federal government ended treaty making and acquired Indian land, this land essentially lost cash value because of the questionable status of the land taking, and it made it more appealing for homesteading and less appealing for cash purchase. So lands that were questionably taken by the federal government could be reclaimed through the courts, creating legal uncertainty. As Karen Hansen points out in her examination of Scandinavian homesteading at Spirit Lake, white homesteaders often knew they were taking Indian land and that they were stealing from the Indians. This helps to explain why and how homesteading continued to grow in the early decades of the 20th century, well over 30 years after treaty making with tribal nations was unilaterally stopped by the federal government. Homesteading on reservations was a way to redistribute Indian land and a way to claim land, if not legally, then through occupation. So this slide then offers Wisconsin as a comparison to Minnesota, and you can look at the two states and see where homesteading occurred. There weren't as many in Wisconsin, but you can still see how widespread homesteading was, particularly in western and northern Wisconsin. This is the last slide and something that I'm really interested in digging in deeper for this next book project. So in the center, you can kind of see a zoom in of the homesteading map, and we can see Mille Lacs here in the south, and we can see Leech Lake. So this image is from the Indian Land Tenure Foundation website, and it shows the land, kind of the land status or land tenure at Leech Lake, and you can see how complicated this is. The yellow land is federal land. A lot of this is the Chippewa National Forest. But if we want to look at American Indian Trust land, that is just the red land. And you can just see that there's only like just tiny little pockets. And then when we also know, we're all from Minnesota, that these both Mille Lacs and Leech Lake are really hot pockets for cabins. High property land often owned by non-native people, right? So I'm thinking like, how did these non-native people come to own this land? And a lot of it we can trace back to the homesteading. So this is Mille Lacs. All the green land is private property, land that had been allotted. Much of that owned by non-native. Of course, some native people do own their land outright. And then the trust land is the land in red again. But yeah, lots of cabins around there too. So that's kind of what I'm digging into for the next book project. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap up posing these kind of questions, thinking about how American Indians were able to use the Homestead Act for their benefit. And the slippages in the land record, because again, race was not collected. So there is no way to search homestead records and see what American Indian people, like just search American Indian homesteaders, right? There really isn't an easy way. Names, but that's also like another, like it's just a lot of digging. And then I'm thinking about contemporary non-native landowners on reservations and how that land was acquired, thinking about the Homestead Act and allotment. And what I really want to do next year on sabbatical is interview these non-native landowners and ask some of these questions. And as we see land back continue to gain momentum, like, is that something on people's radar? So with that, thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to having some questions.
So a couple of things. One, the $18, was that in 1862 for the homestead filing? And for an average wage, so 10 cents an hour?
Yeah, so it was a lot back in the day, but they weren't always required to pay it. Like, it was relatively easy to circumvent that.
Second thing is, just a note, is that there was a second land rush in the latter half of the last century. Being a person living in northern Minnesota, the second land rush was people in the Twin Cities buying cabins around.
Yes.
So the ownership necessarily transferred to even higher value people.
Yes. So part of what I'm working with this geography student to do is to look at those land records and to kind of trace that land ownership and the value of that land over time. We've begun to do that in areas of the Twin Cities, and also to think about like a retail and real estate development.
A question, a couple questions. Have you had an opportunity to speak in public schools?
In public schools?
Yeah, around the area.
I have not.
Suburban areas. And I would think this would be very interesting information for them to understand, to learn. I know when I was in the 50s, there was not much information at all about what was going on. And of course, through your studies, it seems unique to the situation. The second question I have is, you mentioned, John mentioned in your introduction about the Bassett Creek area. He talks, I think that's what I heard. How was your involvement? What was that?
Well, my great colleague, Crystal Boyd, just magically appeared right before I began speaking. So Crystal Boyd is a member of the Valley Community Presbyterian Church. And Crystal, feel free to jump in or correct me if I say anything wrong. But the Valley Community Presbyterian Church, located in Golden Valley, just off of Highway 100, did a land acknowledgement statement, but process. And I like to say that the Valley Community Presbyterian Church is like the best example of what a land acknowledgement process should look like. They didn't, oh, you're involved as well. So it isn't just like, hey, we're going to put this statement together and put it on our website and give ourselves a pat on the back. They did the research, they raised funds, they got grant funding that continues through today. And they reached out to Native community members. So Crystal contacted me as a scholar that writes about American Indians in these suburbs and asked if I would be interested in doing an oral history project. So we collaborated in identifying American Indian people. Particularly, we wanted to focus on Golden Valley, but that felt a little bit too narrow. So it made sense to instead look at the Bassett Creek, the Haha-Wakpadon watershed. So we collectively identified American Indian people who grew up in that area, who worked in that area, who live in that area today. Those interviews are all available online, the audio recording and the transcript. And since that time, like 2021, 2022-ish, this process has continued to morph. And there are continuously events that Valley Community Presbyterian Church is hosting to really honor what a land acknowledgement process works with. They continuously work with Dakota, Ojibwe, and now Ho-Chunk cultural advisors as well. So it's not this one-time moment, it is this continuous ongoing effort.
How did redlining affect mixed race marriages?
Oh, good question. I don't really dig into that so much in my research, but something that I do want to note is in this oral history process, the Haha-Wakpadon Bassett Creek oral history process, I had the ability to interview an Indigenous man, maybe in his 60s, I think he talks about that in the interview, so I'm not outing him. And he talked about his family's experience in the Twin Cities growing up, and when his parents wanted to buy a home and the racism that they were experiencing, going to the banks to try to get a loan when both of them went. And after a while, they recognized, like, hey, we are getting discriminated against. They have a very stereotypical, like, native sounding last name. And when they made that pivot to the white adult going and using the different last name, they got a loan, like, right off the bat. So, you know, when we think about redlining of the 1930s, I mean, the experience he was telling me about was probably from the 1950s, 1960s. So it's something that absolutely affected mixed race families. And I think they probably all navigated it in different ways, right? Either full exclusion or kind of manipulating the system like this family did by sending just the white parent.
And redlining and
So in theory, the court case that was supposed to end it was tied to like the race-based covenants, kind of like in the late 1940s. But we still know that it kind of happened unchecked, even though it was unenforceable. I mean, I think we can argue that it's still happening today, right?
The Fair Housing Act of 1964 kind of really took a legal action on it.
But I think, again, we can still argue that we can see it happening.
So I was actually born in the red line area of Minneapolis, which my grandfather owned. He was white.
Mm-hmm.
So just because it was red line didn't mean you couldn't own it,
Mm-hmm.
white or anybody else. It was, the troll was getting a loan.
Yeah, it's more difficult.
So it wasn't it was the banks that were informed by this, and then that's why you said.
Like it's a risky or dangerous investment. Yeah.
I have a couple of anecdotal kind of things. You mentioned the Little Earth Housing Project, which is in Phillips, just across the freeway from us on Cedar Avenue. And that was a project of the Model City program in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was built not as a Little Earth, but as a low-income housing project. But because Phillips has been historically a place where new settlers settled. So I just realized that you're talking about the Resettlement Relocation Act. That many were located there. And so I don't remember the timeline of when that actually then became Little Earth, but it was after a few years of its having folks living in it. And then, in addition to that, my denomination in the early 80s built All Nations Indian Church, and they put it right in the heart of the Phillips community. And the first minister there, the first pastor, really served, his neighbors that were attending that church, and he was really so active with individuals and all that sort of thing. By the 1990s, I was a pastor in the community and was close to that church, and almost all of the members had moved to the suburbs. And so it's like, those who could afford to got out, and then others were getting towards the Little Earth Housing Project for low-income people.
Yeah, in the book, I do have a chapter that talks about Little Earth and the ways that it was funded and when it initially opened, and like nuns were living there, never paying rent, and it just became like a lot of mismanagement, and how then it kind of shifted and became under the purview of AIM actually, and we kind of saw this shift towards American Indian operated, managed, largely American Indian people living there. And one of the folks that I interviewed for the Oral History Project is the son of a pastor at the All Nations Indian Church. So that's,
it must be now, because that pastor.
yeah. So like contemporary times. But you know, spent time in the suburbs and talks about that experience, you know, coming to Minneapolis, going to the church, supporting his dad, but having this privilege to be a suburban Indian.
Native Americans probably living rurally, which obviously you're not really talking about, but I'm also curious mostly about how the education program in Coon Rapids was, because even where I was at, there was, and I graduated in the 80s, there were no Native American programs or any programs in any of the schools there.
Yeah.
How many students you had in there, and how long the program had been going on, I'm just curious.
Yeah, so for me, the program that I went through and then worked for, it was the Indian Education Program in Anoka, Hennepin. And it was quite large because the school district is so large, Coon Rapids, Anoka, Blaine, Champlain Park, Andover. Um, and that is a federally mandated program based on the population of Native students attending those school districts. So it was about 500 students across the schools, right? K through 12 across all those cities that have their own high schools and middle schools. But outside of that, I don't know how high quality the academic programming is just in like the regular.
Well, where I went to school, there was no classes for Native students in any of the district, which included all the schools, high schools, and grade schools, and which Bemidji is a center, so there's
Yeah.
3 counties.
I like to think it's changing and getting better, but I'm not in the schools anymore.
Just curious.
Yeah.
I was in
Oh, the sheet back there has a microphone. Sorry.
We'll get you.
I just have a question, a little bit of a follow-up question on the Bassett Creek Kakahaha Orphanon, because with all the research that you've done and all the background and understanding of its organization, and were there parts of the interviews maybe that reinforced what you were thinking, parts that maybe surprised you in understanding the roles of Indigenous living in the suburbs?
Yeah. So some of the themes that came out, and Chris will totally jump in here, is pretty much everybody talked about education in some form and how that was really instrumental for them. Particularly the folks that I interviewed that were younger and they came from places like Osseo, which is known for their strong Indian education programming. So that came out. A lot of conversation about climate change, environmental concerns, and that shifting landscape right now and the need to do more, like very actively, was expressed through a lot of the conversations. A lot of people talked about their experience with housing broadly. So maybe moving from Minneapolis to Golden Valley, or always being a renter, or remembering a mixed race family being able to purchase a home in the 1960s, but knowing that like discrimination was a major issue and having to get permission. So those are 3 that I think really came out of the interviews.
Did that kind of help influence your work then, or as you start to bring that information into the work?
Yeah, so my book had already been published by that time that came out, but I did write an article really thinking about place and what that means for Native people. And, one of the questions I asked, because if we think about this landscape, it's Dakota homelands, but I interviewed people from all sorts of tribes, Dakota, Ojibwe, but also people from other tribal nations outside of the state. So, a question was, what does it mean to be a Native person living in the suburbs? What does it mean to be a Dakota person living in your homelands? Or what does it mean to be a Native person whose homelands are outside this area living here? That was a really compelling question because people had to really think about it. And I don't think as Native people, we have been given the opportunity or space to think about what that means.
Yeah, I was in K through 12 not that long ago. So I just wanted to give the K through 12 update. When I was in 6th grade, it was Minnesota history for our history class. We spent probably between a quarter and half of the year specifically on Native history in Minnesota. So that's kind of where that is right now. This is a charter school, so not exactly the same as like St. Paul Public Schools, but nonetheless a public school, and not specifically only for American Indian kids, but for everybody.
I think we need to recognize too that like being a K through 12 teacher is so hard, right? Chronic underfunding, lots of expectations, the testing. So in Wisconsin, we have something called Act 31, and it actually came out of the 1990s, like Walleye Wars area when there was so much racism that we can say because people don't understand the history of treaty making, but because of Act 31, the state of Wisconsin mandates that American Indian history, Wisconsin Indian history is taught at several benchmarks throughout the K through 12 experience. But now this is, almost 30 years later, and we know that it's not being done. It's an unfunded mandate, but also, I'm at the University of Wisconsin, which is well known for their teacher education program. So teachers in training aren't being taught what they need to be able to teach it successfully and taught well in the schools. So there's just so many kind of barriers to that, but recognizing teachers are so overstretched and under-resourced. So I think it just requires kind of like an overhaul who has the ability and capacity to do that. So I think we find really, really amazing examples of teachers making it work.
I guess I can say I really appreciate the fact that you're still a professor in Wisconsin, because I knew somebody who was a professor in Wisconsin, and who actually was forced out of work basically because the colleges are closing. So really appreciate you having you have the work and you're still
Thank
doing
you.
it, even though I know how difficult it is to do that.
I do feel very lucky being at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have very good colleagues at Superior and Oshkosh, and it's oftentimes hard talking to them because they never know what the next month or next semester is going to look like. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on his comment. Thank you for your work, because I think it's so important to document this history. I work at the University of Minnesota, and I had a Native graduate student. I remember she went to a conference in overseas, and they thought that they were so surprised that there were any Native people even left in the U.S. Because she said that the individuals were like, I thought you guys were all gone. So just appreciate your work and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
That's it. You keep teasing us with Crystal, and Crystal is going to do a plug for the oral histories and how you can find them.
Yes, well, Kasey, you're so amazing. She did a fantastic job on this oral history project. And you can find those oral histories online. There's a little card here if you want to use the QR code. You can listen to them as a podcast or on YouTube. And the transcripts are available on the Hennepin History Museum webpage. So if you want to access them, they are really so beautiful. And it's a great way to hear Kasey interacting with people and their experiences around housing. So a huge thank you, Kasey. You did an amazing job.
Thank you. We're always looking for ways to do more, too.
Yeah, what's next at Valley Community Church?
Oh my gosh, well, let me know if you'd like more updates. We are currently doing a photography project along the creek. We've hired an Indigenous photographer to take photos of the creek in all 4 seasons. And we also do an annual event on Indigenous Peoples Day, a water blessing. So that's open to the public. People can come and learn about the creek and enjoy. There's also a 5K in the fall at the Theodore Worth at the trailhead. So if you're into running or walking, you can do a Howcadon 5K. A lot of good stuff.
Well, thank you again, Kasey.
Yes.